what this event means for Greater Chicago is really a beginning of the work that's perhaps the single most important thing that every Chicagoan should be working on, and it's the ability to kind of put ourselves in each other's shoes, kind of understand our individual context, and then work on bringing peace and understanding and wisdom to each other.
I think the National Day of Racial Healing here in Chicago and across the country is an opportunity to do a little bit of the work that so many of our organizers and activists do throughout the year, which is to both challenge and inspire one another with proximity to one another, to our stories, to our challenges, to our aspirations. I think the fierce urgency of now, as Dr. King described it, is driving our communities to realize that we can no longer remain isolated. We can no longer remain disconnected. That our stories in isolation are weaker. That our stories in isolation keep us pitted against one another. But when we come together and have the courage, have the love, the conviction, and faith and trust with one another to share our struggles, to share our ambitions and our aspirations, that there's something magical that could happen in that moment, and that allows us to envision identifying our collective struggles, injustices, but more importantly, to find a way to heal from those injustices, to envision a future where we are genuinely coming together for a broader and more hopeful tomorrow.
I'm so glad that TRHT Greater Chicago had an opportunity to participate in the second National Day of Racial Healing, because last year a bunch of us had just returned from California after the summit, and we didn't actually have a collective vision of what we wanted to do together yet. So this is actually our first day for Greater Chicago, and I think it just signals to each other who are already part of this journey, as well as to those who are part of our collective communities, that we are part of something and that we are welcoming others to be a part of it as well. I think that what is welcoming about this model is, while it is pillared by truth, racial healing to lead to transformation, it is very broad. And it welcomes folks from all different sectors. In fact, it almost requires it. Because it is built upon the premise that people from different walks of life, different experiences, need to come together to actually solve the issues that we're looking for.
I think it means a lot of things for the Greater Chicago region. I think one of them is the ability to confront uncomfortable truths about the way policies, narratives, and all of our struggles, one, are interconnected, but two, have created kind of the society that we're living in. And some of those uncomfortable truths shared at today's event, include that big piece on structural violence, and how some of these policies, are intentionally targeting some of our communities and have made it so that we see more segregation, so that we see a disinvestment in public schools, so that we see a disinvestment in public housing, and how when it all comes together and all of those factors play together, they contribute on a collective basis on this idea that we call, on this racism that we see in our communities, and how I think this event really helps to really bring those truths to light, to acknowledge that racism is not so much about individuals having prejudices towards each other, but about systems that together carry out what racism, as we know it, means in the 21st century. So this event really helps to shed light on those things. I think it matters, especially now, given the current national political climate, but then also given the prominence that Chicago has in that national political climate. Chicago has been the target of attacks from a lot of people and has been held up as kind of the epitome of what was wrong and needs fixing by this new administration. And I think truth, racial healing, and transformation allows us to see that the reason why Chicago and the Greater Chicago region is the way it is not because, of our strict gun control, or it's not because people in our communities are inherently bad, but it's because, again, there's been a targeted intentionality on making sure that our communities stay divided, that they stay poor, that they stay without many economic opportunities. And that structural violence and all of those disinvestments and those inequities have created a fertile ground for the conditions that we see now in Chicago. So I think it's especially relevant now, and especially timely now to start, I think, creating, if structural violence created a fertile ground for violence, then for our efforts to confront truths and to heal from those truths and then transform our communities, I think it creates a fertile ground for peacemaking and for that beloved community that Martin Luther King talked about.
Well, I think truth and racial healing and transformation matters everywhere. I think in Greater Chicago especially, because we are one of the largest cities in our country, and there are often many eyes to our region. I think it's unfortunate that the eyes that are usually on our region are not necessarily positive, right? The headlines talk about violence, and they talk about segregation, but there are a lot of assets in our region, which I think that this work is actually built on. There are so many people and so many movements and so many organizations who are already trying to do this work. And what TRHT Greater Chicago hopes to do is not to actually recreate the wheel. We're not starting something new, but what we're hoping to do is harness the energy and the enthusiasm and the power and communities that already exist here for something even larger, something that we can aspire to do together. To jettison the false hierarchy of race, to have that as a goal, as one organization would never feel reachable, right? But if we link together with a lot of different organizations, a lot of different communities, it actually feels like it can be done. And so that's what I think TRHT means to me here in Greater Chicago.
So many of us in Chicago believe that this city is the iconic, quintessential American city, that if you can get it right in Chicago, you can get it right anywhere. Chicago gave to the nation so many of our great national ways of thinking about urban stories and injustices, from the days of Jane Addams' Hull House, who was an extraordinary pioneer, who was a radical organizer, not credited for being so, who struggled with privilege, who met with activists from across the country, who used to host difficult conversations. When you think about people like Jane Addams over 100 years ago in the city, she was thinking about disparities and what it meant for immigrant, low-income communities living in squalor next to people living with extraordinary privilege. She was challenging us then. And you think about organizers, whether it's the folks like Saul Alinsky, and whether you think about all the great legacy that this city represents, from the Black Panther movement to all of those who came out, not least of which was our 44th president, who also comes out of this long tradition of challenging us and America to aspire to be a better version of ourselves, to think about what that Langston Hughes aspirational vision of America looks like on the ground, and not just in sweet poetry, but what does that look like in the community? What does that look like around issues about equity and education and thriving neighborhoods? Chicago, we've wrestled with this for over 100 years. And I think in many moments it's felt like we got it wrong. And in other moments I feel like the beauty and power in this city is that we haven't stopped wrestling with these conversations.
The truth, racial healing, and transformation work matters to Chicago because we cannot be what some people call the most American of American cities, and at the same time continue to be the most segregated of American cities. I think this process will help us understand why it's okay to not only hang out with each other, but maybe go home to the same neighborhoods and live with each other. I think until we get to the point where we are no longer that segregated, we're going to continue to have conflict. But this, again, process for us, it makes it safe for each other, to live in different places.
My immediate hope is that people will give it a chance. My long-term hope for Greater Chicago TRHT is that it lives beyond any of us who are currently involved. And that we're also making progress to the big goal that we're all after. Sometimes people say, we're trying to work ourselves out of a job, or we wish that we didn't have to be around, which means, that structural racism doesn't exist. And of course, that is the vision, right? But I think sometimes it feels like we're so far away from that seems almost foolhardy to actually put within your sights. I think it needs to be within the universe of expectations, but we need to have a lot of milestones before that, So my first hope for Greater Chicago TRHT is that people feel welcome to participate, that they meet people and have meaningful relationships along the way that will sustain them through the very frustrating parts of this work.
My hope for the truth, racial healing, and transformation work here in Chicago is that real, genuine spaces that challenge us to confront sometimes the very uncomfortable truths that have permeated structures and systems, that have enabled a great degree of the type of luxuries that a lot of us have been privileged to experience in the city. A beautiful lake, a nice downtown. There are consequences for that when you're not seeing the larger picture. And here in the city, we have an opportunity to really have those difficult conversations about equity, about disparity. And I think coming to a table that both challenges you, but then also leaves open the possibility of healing, not just as a easy way out of the truth, but as a way up to actually empower the very communities that have been on the losing side of so much of the disparity. I'd like to think about it, and I often talk about it as the calling out, but also calling up scenario. It's one thing to call something out, and that's the truth, and we have to use the truth, and we have to be witnesses for truth, even if it means against our own selves. And I believe that. I believe that's a spiritual injunction. I believe that that's critical in Chicago, in urban centers across the United States, and especially at a time where the idea of truth has become so obscure, and where people are becoming, have been able to manipulate the truth. We need to not steer away from the realities of our lived experiences and hear those experiences, and hear them from one another, hear them directly from the voices of families and people who have lived those experiences and continue to live with the consequences of those experiences. But we also need to challenge one another for the sake of those families, for the sake of those communities, to think about where is the aspirational space for healing? How do we not only call out, but call up to something? And I feel, as an organizer, an activist, and a person who takes faith conviction seriously, that if you're not calling up, your calling out is only going to lead to a space and place that may, in fact, reveal the suffering, but never alleviate it. And we must be willing to actually go through the process of not only revealing the great sources of suffering, but working with one another to actually alleviate that. And I believe a process like this opens up a real structured, but still very organic way to embark on that journey.
My hopes for the Greater Chicago TRHT are that we have every single major foundation, institution, public entity to get engaged, and not only send your second, third, fourth people in command, send leaders, and then some people deep in organizations to get involved in this work. I mean, that's really my hope, because only through this engagement with each other for this common good that we believe is racial healing and truth and transformation can we make this city reach its fullest potential.
A lot of different hopes. One, I hope that TRHT really makes people feel uncomfortable. I really hope that TRHT plays a role in making sure that we create a common language, a shared common language of truths in Chicago, where we can be the really kind of the people pushing the boundaries on policy, on fighting systemic inequities and giving other people and encouraging other people to step up and make others feel uncomfortable, whether they are in City Hall, whether they're in Springfield, or whether they're in some of our communities. I think TRHT can play a really good role in being that, that fierce pusher of boundaries when it comes to what we see in our city. The other hope I think that I have is to really engage young people in a genuine way. I think if TRHT can, I think TRHT, one of my hopes for it is to give young people a crucial role in the steering of what TRHT does and becomes. And I only say that because I think these problems they're not going to be solved, I think, in one's lifetime. I think we're going to chip away at the problem, and I think every generation has its role in chipping away at the larger problem because it's so big and wide. Then I think no one generation can undo centuries of harm. But I think if we involve young people in the process, then by the time they become, the Rick Estradas, the Juan Salgados of our communities, then they will already be immersed in the work and we'll have to start from scratch. And I think if we give young people that opportunity, they're already there. I think young people like myself, I speak for myself, I think this is what we grew up knowing to be true, so it's not that new for us, but I think we still need to be armed with the tools to be able to solve some of these issues. So if we engage young people who will be the leaders of tomorrow, today, I think it could be a really good way and a really good hope for me of what TRHT can become.
When I went through the racial healing circles at the Kellogg Foundation Summit, I think it was a year ago in December, I actually remember the night before when I saw that we were going to do racial healing all the next day. I was like, oh my gosh, I don't know. I may stay in my hotel room, or I don't know if this is for me. And it was actually the most transformational part of the summit for me. But I also believe that racial healing, for some people, is also the hardest part to understand if you haven't actually gone through it yourself. And so when I explain it to people, it's actually, you haven't healed, right, after a healing circle. In many ways, you've actually become more exposed because you're sharing something about yourself to sometimes a group of strangers. One of the most intimate, vulnerable possible situations you can possibly be in. But you walk away with this connection with these strangers that you would never have imagined, 6-7 hours ago. And so I think that that's this notion of proximity, And so when I think about racial healing, I think about what, Dr. Martin Luther King talked about, which is creating a beloved community, and this interconnectedness between us. And so this concept of I care about you because I know what you do affects me, I don't think is enough to get people to change. I think it also has to be that I care what happens to you, and I know what happens to you also impacts me. And I can't care about you if I don't know you, And so that's, for me, what racial healing is. And it doesn't actually have to be about race. It's about age, different communities. One of our speakers talked today that for him growing up, it wasn't about race. It was about someone who lived 2 blocks away from them who were in a different, area of their neighborhood that they thought as others. And so I don't think that you can other people when you have built relationships and you've shared, important parts of and facets of your life with them, and they've done the same. So that's what I think racial healing is about. And I actually think that is kind of the lifeblood of what makes this initiative different. We can't think our way through the problems and think that it's just going to take hold, right? Because I actually think that we've got a lot of smart people in this country. We actually know pragmatically what the policies are and what the systems and the practices are that need to be changed. We don't have a drought of solutions. We have a drought of commitment, political will, and relationships and trust, and really to make what we know needs to happen. And that's where I think this proximity, this beloved community, and racial healing comes into play.
I think racial healing will play a crucial role in anything that we do. I think sometimes, even as an organizer, we want to, I want to, for instance, go out there and lobby elected officials or policymakers without taking a step back and understanding that our community needs healing too. And I think sometimes in our effort to pursue a more just and humane world, I think we forget to meet people where they're at. And I think part of being woke and part of being, I hate to use the word enlightened, but kind of awake to and enlightened to all of these social justice issues also means the ability to be able to meet people where they're at and giving them time to heal. Shedding light on some of the truths and understanding that with all of those uncomfortable truths that we all share, there's a lot of trauma that exists. So in order to overcome some of that trauma, we need racial healing. We need the ability to be able to have a space where we can all just share in our collective pain, but overcome our collective pain. And I think without doing that, it's very hard for us to get to the transformation piece. And I think Grace mentions it all the time, but that's why truth, racial healing, and transformation go in that order, right? You shed light on the truths that that most of us know to be true and that are true. But then with that comes you're shaking a bottle, that's ready to explode because you're shaking up all of these truths. And then it's the ability racial healing is the ability to give it time to settle, right? And for people to kind of digest their own truths and then collectively process, their pain and their suffering. And then from there, I think we get to transformation. But without racial healing, I think that's a required intermediary step between truth and transformation.
I think healing among all things in this country needs to begin first and foremost on this larger socially constructed notion of race, this false hierarchy of human value, and an understanding that when we talk about that false hierarchy, that's not a black-white narrative. That's not something that just affects one family or one community, that we've all been absolutely absorbed in this. And that racial healing is in part by first and foremost revealing and exposing how we all have been victimized by the narrative, the false narrative of this human hierarchy. We've all been victimized and pitted against one another in ways. The children and the grandfathers and grandmothers of the tiki tortures in Charlottesville themselves were inevitably, I guarantee you, at one point or the other, victims of the same racial narrative that they are now trying to promulgate in places like Charlottesville. There was at one point in this country over 70,000 women sterilized, forced sterilized, against their will because they were seen to be feeble-minded. And they were put out in the early part of the 20th century as people who there were scientific and religious theories, but promulgated by major academics, intellectuals, and major power players across the country as people who were seen to pollute the American gene pool. It was the same thinking that, in fact, led to the Holocaust and genocidal actions against Jews. And that conversation is intricately related to race because it drove immigration policy in 1924 that kept the parents of Anne Frank from ever arriving to the shores of America, and drove a type of immigration policy that only created this notion of a white European as only an Anglo-Saxon and Protestant, the only type of acceptable immigrant on the shores of America. Decades later, we find the very people who were descendants of the victims of these policies bamboozled into thinking that somehow the idea of whiteness works in their favor, that somehow the idea of upholding some of the worst chapters of a dark history is somehow in their interest. So the process of dismantling the narratives around race are absolutely critical to the project of finding a a place where we can heal and come together as one people.
Racial healing will play a role in the work here because it's uncomfortable to talk about racial healing. People naturally want to move towards changing narrative or talking about justice because that allows them to avoid the pain and hurt that we carry with us. This racial healing gives us an opportunity to first look in and then later listen to the stories of others, understand the commonality, and then respect the commonality and then move forward. It allows us to unlock this opportunity to move forward.